She didn't shout, she didn't call her husband, and she definitely didn't go to the police. Because the moment Celestine Voss saw the message, she already knew two things. Someone had been watching her daughter, and they thought she wouldn't find out. They were wrong. What they didn't know was that Celestine had already started planning how to destroy them, quietly, completely, and without leaving a single trace. And now, weeks later, she sat across from the most feared man in the state. No weapon, no lawyer, no backup. Just a glass of white wine she never touched and a small black envelope resting between her fingers. And when she slid it across that table toward him, the air between them changed. You could almost feel it, the weight of whatever was inside pressing down on the entire moment like a hand on a shoulder. He looked at it, he looked at her, and something flickered behind his eyes that men like him are never supposed to show. Fear, real fear. The kind that crawls up from somewhere deep inside a person and reminds them, no matter how untouchable they believe they are, that there is always someone who knows more than they think. Always someone watching, always someone waiting. And on this particular afternoon, that someone was Celestine Voss, a wife, a mother, and the last person on earth that man should have underestimated. Every quiet year, every careful decision, every morning she looked at her daughter and made a private promise that the world her husband moved in would never reach the life she was building for that child. All of it had been leading to this moment. This quiet, terrifying exchange between two people sitting in the afternoon sun did not begin the day of the meeting. It began long before. It began in a place called Harwick, Montana, tucked between silence and mountains and secrets old enough to have names. And it began with a family that most of the city pretended not to see, and with a daughter who had no idea how close the darkness had come or what her mother had done to push it back.
Think about the people you love most in this world right now. Think about your child. Think about the moment you looked at them, really looked at them, and felt something so fierce and so unbreakable inside your chest that you understood, without a single word being spoken, that you would burn down everything to keep them safe. Now imagine that someone with power, someone with money, someone who had spent decades convincing the world that its rules simply did not apply to him. Imagine that person decided your child was a tool, a resource, something to be used and then discarded or threatened into silence. What would you do? Where would your line be? And here is the harder question. What if protecting them required you to become something that in the daylight world you could not fully explain? What if the only path through ran directly through the worst room in the building? That is the question at the center of everything that happened in Harwick. And the answer is more complicated, more human, more devastating, and ultimately more beautiful than anything you are probably imagining right now. There are four people at the center of this story. Celestine Voss, a woman who had spent 20 years building a life around quiet strength, private loyalty, and the kind of love that does not announce itself. Her husband, Aldric Voss, a man whose name made certain rooms go still the moment it entered, a man who had organized the shadow economy of an entire region through a combination of patience, intelligence, and the particular authority of someone who has never had to raise his voice because everyone already knows he means it. Their daughter, Nadia, 18 years old, enrolled at a small college, full of the kind of earnest, open light that makes you believe the world is better than it actually is. And then there is Cormac Feld, a man who had spent 20 years accumulating power and protection through calculation, through careful placed alliances, through the slow, careful work of making himself necessary to too many people at once for any single one of them to move against him. He believed he was untouchable. He had been for a very long time. And then he made the one mistake that undid all of it. He made it personal. Harwick is the kind of city that people who live there either love deeply or feel forgotten inside. It has good schools. It has a hardware store on the main street that has been there for 40 years. It has long winters and summers that feel earned, and a landscape that demands a kind of respect people from smaller, flatter places do not always understand. And underneath it all, running like a current beneath perfectly still water, it has always carried a shadow economy, not the kind that gets taught in classrooms, the kind that lives in handshakes and favors and quiet arrangements between men who never write anything down, who communicate in the particular shorthand of people who have known each other long enough to speak almost entirely in implication. Aldric Voss had not invented that economy. He had organized it. He had reduced the chaos of what existed before him into something that functioned, not well, not cleanly, but consistently. And people in Harwick understood this the way they understood the weather, as a condition of life, larger than themselves, beyond their ability to change.
Celestine had known Aldric since she was 22. She had not fallen in love with the version the rest of the world saw. She had fallen in love with the version that existed when all of that fell away, when it was just the two of them in a kitchen at 7 in the morning, or beside each other in a waiting room with nothing to do but be present, or lying in the dark talking about small things. She had made a choice, the kind you make with your eyes completely open, knowing the weight of what you were choosing, to build her life beside a man who carried heavy things. And she had helped carry some of those heavy things herself, quietly, without complaint, because that was the agreement they had reached before they ever said it out loud. But there was one condition. One line she had established at the very beginning and never moved a single inch. Nadia stays out of it. Nadia lives clean. Nadia gets the life neither of us ever had. That was the deal. And for 18 years they had kept it within a consistency that required enormous, invisible effort. Nadia grew up in a house of warmth and rules, and the careful performance of normalcy that families like hers learn to maintain the way families maintain lawns, with daily attention, with the understanding that the moment you stop, things grow over. She did not know the full dimensions of her father's world. She knew enough. She knew his name carried weight. She knew certain conversations ended when she walked into a room, and this was not an invitation to ask why. She had inherited her mother's gift for reading the edges of things, for sensing the places where curiosity was not welcome, and she had lived comfortably within those edges, because her life inside them was genuinely good. She had friends, she had passions, she had a mind that worked quickly, and a heart that was open in the generous, unguarded way of people who have been loved consistently since birth. At 18, she enrolled at a small college 2 hours from Harwick in a program studying environmental science, a subject she had chosen because it required you to believe that damaged systems could recover if you treated them with care. She shared an apartment with a girl named Petra from Wyoming who laughed too loudly and ate cereal at midnight, and whom Nadia loved immediately and completely. She was building something, a life of her own design, and she had no idea that someone had already decided to use it.
Cormac Feld had been operating in the region for years, always careful, always slightly outside the boundary of Aldric's territory, not out of respect, out of patience. He was the kind of man who watches and waits and builds a map over years, identifying pressure points, cataloging vulnerabilities, waiting for the moment when applying pressure to the right place would produce the result he needed. He had decided sometime in the year before everything came apart that the most efficient way to destabilize Aldric Voss was not a direct move. Direct moves were expensive and loud and invited retaliation from too many directions. The more elegant approach was leverage, specifically the kind of leverage that came from reaching into the single space Aldric had always kept sealed off: his family, his daughter, the one person in the world whose safety Aldric would compromise almost anything else to protect. Cormac had seen this pattern before. He knew how to use it, and he set it in motion with the particular cold efficiency of a man who has stopped thinking about people as people. One of Cormac's associates, a young man named Bram Cullen, who had the kind of easy, friendly face that made people drop their guard, had begun to appear in Nadia's life, carefully, gradually,
The way a season changes, you do not notice until it has already happened. The same coffee shop near her college, the library on Tuesday afternoons, the music venue she visited on Friday evenings. He was easy to talk to. He asked good questions. He laughed at the right moments. And Nadia, raised to be kind and open and to believe that the world generally contained more good than bad, had found no reason to be suspicious. They became something resembling friends over the course of 5 or 6 weeks, and then the questions shifted incrementally, so gradually that no single question felt wrong, toward things that were not casual at all. Where does your father travel? Does he keep an office separate from the house? Do you ever see people come by you do not recognize?
Nadia had answered some of them without fully understanding what she was doing. And then something in the quality of the questions had changed enough that she felt it, a cold, specific, disorienting recognition. The feeling of understanding all at once that you had been reading a situation entirely wrong. She had pulled away from Brahm immediately, but not before he had recorded multiple conversations on his phone. And when Nadia had confronted him, he had not apologized. He had smiled, the particular smile of someone who already knows how this ends, and he had told her, in a voice so carefully neutral it was almost gentle, that those recordings, if delivered to the right people, could be edited into something that would look very different from what they actually were. He told her they could make her look complicit. He told her they could expose her father to a federal investigation that would destroy everything. He told her to stay quiet, and Nadia, who was 18 years old and alone in an apartment 2 hours from home, believed every word of it. Can you imagine that? Can you put yourself in that position for a moment? 18 years old, alone, having just understood that you were manipulated by someone you thought was a friend, and now being told that the evidence of that manipulation can be turned into a weapon against your family, and that the only way to prevent it is to say nothing to anyone who loves you. How heavy would that be? How do you carry that? How do you go home for the holidays and look your mother in the eye and pretend that you are fine? Nadia tried. She went quiet on the phone. She stopped calling as often. She lost weight she did not have to lose. She started sleeping badly, lying awake in the dark, listening to Petra's breathing from the other side of the apartment, running the same calculations over and over, arriving at the same terrifying nowhere every time.
And Celestine, who had been watching her daughter since before Nadia could walk, who 20 years of accumulated knowledge of exactly what her daughter's voice sounded like when she was carrying something, Celestine knew. Before Nadia said a word, before she made a single direct admission, Celestine knew that something had reached her child, and she was already moving. It took Celestine 11 days to understand the shape of what had happened. 11 days of quiet, careful, methodical work, the kind that leaves no trace, that does not announce itself, that happens in the margins of ordinary life while dinner is made and laundry is folded and phone calls are returned. She had people she trusted who were entirely her own, not connected to Aldric's network, not people who would report back to him or move without her instruction. A woman named Odessa, who had spent 20 years in private investigation before going entirely independent, and who had the particular gift of finding things that powerful people believed they had successfully hidden. A former city attorney named Theobald, who still maintained access to certain records that were technically public but practically nearly impossible to retrieve without the right chain of connections. Celestine had built these relationships over years, quietly and intentionally, in the understanding that the world she lived in occasionally required resources that existed outside her husband's reach. She had hoped for 18 years that she would never need them for anything serious. She had always known she might. What Odessa and Theobald found was this: Bram Cullen was not operating on his own initiative. He reported directly to Cormac Feld. The targeting of Nadia had been deliberate and strategic.
She had been selected specifically because of who her father was, as part of a long-term plan to acquire leverage over Aldric's operation. The recordings were real, and they were designed to be weaponized. Stripped of context, edited to remove anything that made Nadia's innocence clear, they could be made to look like deliberate information sharing. They could be delivered to federal contacts that Cormac had carefully cultivated over the years, and the resulting investigation would reach not just Aldric, but Nadia herself, implicating her in things she had never knowingly been part of. It was the kind of trap that had been constructed from the very beginning to be inescapable from the inside. You could not fight your way out of it. You could not talk your way out of it. You could only make the person holding it decide that releasing it was more dangerous than keeping it sealed. Celestine understood this within minutes of reading Odessa's first report, and she sat with that understanding for one full day, not panicking, not unraveling, not making a single move until she had thought through every possible outcome of every possible response, because that was how she had always operated, completely, patiently, to the end. When she had finished thinking, she knew what she needed. She needed to make Cormac Feld understand that releasing those recordings would cost him more than keeping them sealed. And to do that, she needed something he valued above every other thing in the world. She needed something about Cormac himself, something real, something verified, something that would, if released to the right people, cause him damage he could not recover from. She went looking, and what she found was remarkable.
If this part of the story is hitting different, drop a comment right now with the words, "I see you, Celestine." Let's see who is really watching. And tell us where in the world you are watching from. Years before Cormac had established himself in Montana, before the transport operation, before the territory, before the carefully constructed reputation, there had been a federal investigation in another state. It had ended strangely. Charges dropped, witnesses recanting, evidence ruled inadmissible through a sequence of procedural decisions that individually seemed explainable and collectively seemed impossible to have occurred by chance. Most people who knew about it assumed Cormac had simply bought his way clear. Money talked in courtrooms in ways that left no fingerprints. What almost no one knew, what Celestine, through Odessa and Theobald, and a chain of source connections so indirect it required a diagram to follow, was that Cormac that not just escaped that investigation, he had cooperated with it. For 14 months, he had provided detailed, specific, actionable intelligence about two separate organizations whose operations partially overlapped with his own. He had been, for 14 months, an informant, and the organizations whose people he had helped put away, the people whose operations he had dismantled in exchange for his own immunity, were organizations with very long memories, very deep connections, and the specific kind of institutional culture that does not forgive certain categories of betrayal, ever, under any circumstances. If that information reached the right people, Cormac Feld would not simply face professional consequences. He would face the kind of consequences that do not involve courtrooms. Celestine had documentation, copies of sealed records, witness statements, timeline corroboration, enough to be credible, enough to be, if released to the people who needed to see it, catastrophic for the man who had spent years believing that particular chapter of his life was buried permanently. She had it all copied, organized, and sealed in a small black envelope. She had also, with the same methodical care she brought to every other element of this operation, arranged for identical copies to be held by 3 separate individuals, Odessa, Theobald, and a third party whose identity she kept entirely to herself, with explicit instructions: if Celestine did not make personal contact within 48 hours of the scheduled meeting, every copy was to be released simultaneously to the parties named in the accompanying instructions. She was building a safety net so complete that even if something went wrong,
Even if Cormac decided that the most efficient solution to this problem was simply to remove Celestine from it, the outcome would still be the same. She would not walk into that meeting unprotected. She would walk in holding something far more powerful than any weapon. She would walk in holding the complete, documented record of the worst thing Cormac Feld had ever done. And he would not know until she was already sitting across from him exactly how thoroughly he had been outmaneuvered. She called his office on a Tuesday afternoon. She left a message with his assistant. She used her full name. She said she would like to arrange a meeting to discuss a matter of mutual concern, that she preferred somewhere public and pleasant, and that she was prepared to be flexible on timing. She said in the same calm, even tone you use when you are telling someone the time of an appointment, that if he declined to meet, she would have certain documents delivered to certain parties by end of business Thursday. And that was all. No edge in her voice, no performance of threat, just information offered to a man who would know exactly what it meant. Cormac Feld called back within 2 hours.
Here is a question worth sitting with. When Cormac Feld heard Celestine's name and understood what she was saying, when he called back within 2 hours and agreed to that meeting, what do you think he was feeling? Do you think it was anger, calculation? Or do you think there was something underneath all of it that surprised even him? Something that felt uncomfortably close to respect? Because there is a particular moment that happens when a person who has built their entire identity around being the most powerful presence in every room suddenly encounters someone who is completely, quietly unafraid of them. Think about the Celestines in your own life. The people who have stood between you and something terrible without ever telling you the full story of what they did. Drop their names in the comments. Celebrate them for a second. The morning of the meeting, Celestine woke before dawn. She made coffee, she sat at the kitchen table in the early dark, and she held the mug with both hands, and she gave herself permission, for just a few minutes, to feel everything she had been holding back for the past 3 weeks. The fear, the anger that lived underneath the fear like bedrock, the grief, and it was grief, make no mistake, of learning that someone had deliberately chosen your child as a target, that they had looked at the thing you love most in the world and seen a resource, a pressure point, a means to an end. She sat with all of that. She felt all of it, and then she set it down. She could not carry it into the meeting. Emotion is information, and she could not afford to give Cormac Feld information he had not earned. She reviewed the contents of the envelope one final time. She confirmed with each of her 3 document holders that instructions had been received and understood. She texted Odessa a single word, proceeding, and she drove to the restaurant alone, a terrace she had chosen deliberately for its openness, for the afternoon light, for the specific logic that men like Cormac do not make large, visible, irreversible decisions in beautiful public places where every table is within view of every other table. The drive was an hour and 20 minutes through a landscape of such sustained, indifferent beauty that she almost smiled. She had always loved the way this part of the state looked in the late morning. She had been meaning to see it more. She had been meaning to do many things. Cormac was already at the table when she arrived. He had come with 2 associates, positioned at nearby tables in the way that is meant to look casual and does not. She registered them without acknowledging them and took her seat across from him. A server came, and she ordered water and a glass of white wine she fully intended to look at and not touch. She wanted her hands to have somewhere to be. She wanted her mind completely clear.
Cormac was, in person, exactly what his reputation had prepared her for, and somehow still smaller than it was. He had the stillness of a man who had trained himself over decades to reveal nothing, and she respected that craft, the way you respect a skill in someone you fully intend to defeat him with it. He spoke first. He said he had always respected her husband's way of conducting business. He said he hoped they could have a productive conversation. He used the word productive 3 times in the first 2 minutes, and each time she heard it, She felt the specific texture of a man who is stalling because he does not yet know how much she knows. She let him talk. She watched his hands. She waited until he had exhausted his opening and was waiting to see what she would do next. And then she reached into her bag and placed the small black envelope on the table between them. She did not push it toward him immediately. She let it sit there between them in the golden afternoon light while she looked at him, and she said, in a voice that was barely louder than conversation, that what was inside the envelope was a gift. She said she wanted him to understand that before he opened it. A gift and a warning and a proposal, all contained in the same package. And then she slid it across the table toward him, slowly, deliberately, with the composure of someone who has already run every version of this moment in her mind and arrived at this one. He looked at the envelope for a long time before he picked it up. And when he opened it and began reading, when his eyes moved across the first page and then the second and then the third, she watched something happen to his face that she had only seen happen once before in her life. She watched the architecture of his composure come apart, not loudly, not dramatically, quietly, the way very old certainties sometimes dissolve, not with a crash, but with a slow, horrible stillness, the ground shifting under something that had always stood with such certainty that it forgotten to check whether the foundation was sound. His hands did not shake, his jaw did not drop, but his eyes changed. And the silence that followed was the loudest thing she had heard in years. She let him read every page. She did not rush him. She looked out at the landscape beyond the terrace, at the rolling distance and the water and the enormous blue sky, and she breathed slowly and evenly, and she thought about how Nadia waking up that morning 2 hours away in her apartment, probably eating cereal because Petra always had 3 kinds. She thought about how ordinary that image was, how completely and fiercely she intended to protect it. When she heard Cormac set the last page down, she looked back at him, and she spoke. She told him that 3 people currently held identical copies of what he had just read, with instructions to release them simultaneously to specific parties if she did not make personal contact within 48 hours.
She told him these copies would not go to law enforcement. She told him exactly where they would go. She watched him process that. She watched the full weight of it land. And then she said, still in that same even, unhurried voice, that she had no interest in his operation, his business, or his territory. She had never had any interest in those things. She was not there to negotiate a transfer of power, or demand ongoing tribute, or claim any piece of anything he had built. She wanted 2 things only. First, the recordings Bram Cullen had made of her daughter, every copy, every backup, every file on every device deleted permanently, with Odessa present as her witness to verify the process. Second, Cormac's personal assurance given directly to her face that Nadia's name would never again be spoken in connection with anything he or anyone who reported to him was involved in. That was all. In exchange, those envelopes stayed sealed forever. He looked at her for a long time. The 2 men at the adjacent tables had gone completely still, that rigid, alert stillness of people who have just realized they are in the presence of something they fundamentally misjudged. Cormac put the documents back inside the envelope. He placed it on the table in front of him. He picked up his glass and set it back down without drinking. And then he asked her one question. He asked her why she had come herself. Why not send a representative? Why sit across from him personally? She looked at him, and she said, because my daughter needed to know that the people who were supposed to protect her did not just send someone. She said, because some things you do yourself,
and because she had wanted her to be the one sitting directly across from him when he understood the full scale of his miscalculation. She had wanted him to look her in the eye. She had wanted him to say it to her face, not to a lawyer, not to an intermediary, to her, the mother of the girl he had chosen to use as a weapon. She wanted him to say yes to her specifically, and he did. He said it quietly, without elaboration, without negotiation, the way men say yes when they have run every available calculation and arrived at a single viable answer. He said every recording would be deleted by midnight, with Odessa present as her witness to verify the process. He said Nadia's name would not be spoken in any of his spaces again. And then he said something she had not expected. He said that he had underestimated her. She said very evenly that she knew. And then she stood up. She picked up her bag. She left the wine untouched. She thanked him for his time in the tone of someone concluding a routine appointment, and she walked off that terrace, through the restaurant, out into the afternoon, without looking back once.
She sat in her car in the parking area for a few minutes before she started the engine. She held the steering wheel with both hands and she breathed. She let herself feel, in private, something she had not allowed herself all morning. Not triumph. Something quieter and more complex than that. Relief was part of it, but only a part. The larger part was the specific, exhausting weight that comes from having done something enormous entirely in silence. From having carried every piece of it yourself and not asked anyone to help carry it, and then set it down and realized how heavy it had actually been. She had protected her daughter. She had done what needed to be done, and it had worked. But there is a cost to carrying things alone, and she felt that cost sitting in that car, in the afternoon light, in a way she would not let anyone witness. She sat with it for exactly as long as she needed to, and then she started the car, and she drove home, and she started making phone calls. By midnight that night, Odessa confirmed every recording had been deleted, every file, every backup on every device Cormac's people had access to. Odessa had watched the process personally, verified the technical confirmation, and sent Celestine a text afterward that contained a single word, done. Celestine replied with 2 words, thank you. And then she sat in the living room of her house, in the dark and the quiet, for a long time before she finally went to bed. She told Aldric 3 days later. She had thought carefully about what to say and how much of it to say. She gave the shape of what had happened, enough that he understood fully what had been done to Nadia, and enough that he understood fully what Celestine had done about it. She had thought she was prepared for his reaction. She had expected some version of the anger that men who believe protective responsibility belongs specifically to them experience when they learn that their family required protection they did not know about and therefore did not provide. She was prepared for that. She had her response ready. What she was not prepared for was the silence. He sat at the kitchen table and he put his hands flat on the surface, and he looked at the wood grain for almost 5 full minutes, completely still, completely quiet. And then he looked up at her with an expression she had not seen on his face before, or perhaps had seen and not recognized, and he said, "You did this alone?" She said yes, and he said nothing for another long moment, and then very quietly he said, "I have never in my life been more afraid of you than I am right now." And it was not an insult. She could tell immediately, with the certainty of 20 years of reading this man, that it was not an insult. It was the closest thing to reverence she had ever heard from him. The recognition of someone finally perceiving the full dimensions of the person they had been standing next to for 20 years.
He asked about Nadia. Celestine told him Nadia did not know everything. She knew her mother had handled it. She knew she was safe. She knew the recordings were gone. And she knew, because Celestine had told her directly, without softening, that she had made a mistake in trying to carry it alone, and that no one in that family expected her to carry anything that size by herself. That coming to the people who loved her was never weakness. It was always the right answer. Nadia had cried when Celestine said that. The specific release of someone who has been holding something very heavy for too long and finally has permission to set it down. Celestine had held her, the way she had held her in hospital waiting rooms and after nightmares, and on the first day of every school year when the morning felt too large, and she had said nothing because there was nothing to say that the holding did not say more clearly. They had sat like that for a long time in Nadia's apartment, with the November light low through the windows and Petra respectfully gone for the afternoon. And Celestine would say later to Odessa that that hour, that quiet, unremarkable hour in a small apartment that smelled like cereal and the specific chemical warmth of a space heater, was more important than anything that had happened on the terrace, more important than the documentation, more important than the meeting. It was the whole point of all of it. That hour was what she was protecting. Think about what Nadia must have felt in that moment. Think about being 18 years old and believing you were trapped, believing the thing you had stumbled into had no exit, that the only way to protect your family was to disappear inside your own silence and never let anyone see how badly you were drowning. And then think about what it means to have someone walk through that wall you built and sit down beside you and say, "You should have told me, but I already knew, and I already handled it, and you are already safe, and none of this is your fault, and you do not have to carry it for one more second." How does that land? Think about whether there is someone in your life who has ever said something like that to you. Think about whether you have ever said it to someone else. Some of the most powerful moments of our lives happen in kitchens and apartments and quiet rooms where nothing looks extraordinary from the outside. They only look extraordinary from the inside, where they are happening.
6 months passed. Cormac honored the agreement as far as Celestine could tell. Her people kept watch, not obsessively, but consistently. And there was no indication that the recordings had survived or that Nadia had been approached by anyone connected to Cormac's operation. Life began to move back toward its normal rhythm. Nadia returned to her studies with something renewed in her. Not the exact version of herself from before, because you do not pass through something like that and come back identical, but a version that was in some ways stronger, more knowing. She had looked at the specific darkness of being used by someone you trusted, and she had survived it. And there is a particular kind of confidence that comes from surviving specific things. She threw herself into her coursework. She wrote a research paper on watershed restoration in the Northern Rockies that her professor submitted to a regional academic publication. She called home a lot. She called home a lot. And each time Celestine heard her daughter's voice, each time she heard the life back in it, the warmth and the humor and the easy comfort of a person who feels safe, she felt something she did not have a precise word for, but would have described approximately as gratitude so complete it had no edges. And then, 4 months after the meeting on the terrace, the federal task force arrived. It had nothing to do with Celestine. It had nothing to do with the sealed records she held or the arrangement she had made. It was the result of nearly 2 years of independent investigative work by a federal task force that had been building a case against Cormac Feld's transport operation through entirely conventional channels. Financial records, communications intercepts, informants cultivated within his own network long before Celestine had ever made that phone call on a Tuesday afternoon. The investigators had been patient in the way that federal cases are patient, methodically, across years, accumulating evidence with the understanding that cases built slowly tend to stand up better in court than cases built quickly. And in the late spring, agents arrived at 3 properties simultaneously, and Cormac Feld was taken into federal custody on charges that his lawyers, capable as they were, could not navigate entirely around. Celestine watched the coverage on the evening news, standing in her kitchen, still holding the dish towels she had been using when Aldric called her name from the other room. She watched the reporter describe the charges in that careful, neutral way local news describes things. She watched the brief footage of a vehicle and a statement from a federal spokesperson, and she felt not what she had expected to feel. She had imagined, in some version of this moment she had run in her head, that she would feel something definitive, closure, relief of a final kind. What she actually felt was tired. Deeply, profoundly, specifically tired. the tiredness that accumulates over a year of vigilance and calculation and quiet, constant readiness, and that you only feel once you finally set down the thing you have been prepared to use. She was tired, and she was grateful, and she turned off the television and went back to doing the dishes.
6 weeks after Cormac's arrest, Celestine received a letter, handwritten, postmarked from a federal holding facility in Nevada, where Bram Cullen, who had been arrested alongside his employer on related charges, was awaiting sentencing. Bram Cullen had written to Celestine, not to threaten, not to negotiate, not to request anything, to apologize. The letter was 4 pages long, written in the careful, slightly formal handwriting of a young man composing something he understood might be the most consequential thing he had ever put on paper. He wrote that he had known, from the 3rd conversation he had with Nadia, that she was not what Cormac had told him she was. He wrote that she was kind, genuinely, specifically kind, in a way he had not encountered in a very long time, that she had asked him questions about his actual life, where he had grown up, what he had wanted to be when he was younger, whether he had people who knew him well, and that he had answered those questions honestly, because no one in the circles he moved in asked them, and there was something in being asked them that he had not known he needed until she had done it. He wrote that he had tried twice to tell Cormac that Nadia was not useful for what he intended, that she was genuinely uninvolved, that using her this way was wrong. He wrote that both times Cormac had told him to do his job and made the consequences of not doing it clear in terms that required no elaboration. He wrote that he had spent the months since his arrest thinking about the people who bore the weight of the things he had done, and that he had decided that the only useful thing he still had the power to do was tell the truth wherever telling it might matter. He said he had given a voluntary statement to federal investigators confirming that the recordings contained nothing of substance, that they had been manufactured to appear incriminating through selective editing, and that Nadia had never knowingly shared sensitive information with anyone. He said this statement had been given without an arrangement for leniency. He simply could not let the record stand the way it was. He closed by saying he did not expect forgiveness. He was not writing to receive anything. He was writing because writing it was the right thing to do, and he had spent too long doing wrong things when right ones were available, and he was tired of it. Celestine read the letter twice. She read it at the kitchen table in the early morning, holding it with both hands, feeling the specific weight of 4 handwritten pages from a young man who had chosen to write something true when it cost him something. And when she had finished reading it the 2nd time, she placed it carefully on the table and looked at it in the quiet of the house, and she felt something she had not expected to feel about Bram Cullen, something that surprised her considerably, something that, if she were honest, felt uncomfortably and inconveniently close to compassion. Because she understood what that letter had cost him. She understood that writing it had required him to look directly and without flinching at the worst version of himself and make a different choice than the one he had always made. And she understood, because she had spent her life in proximity to a world that made different choices extraordinarily difficult, that choosing differently, when everything in your history and environment has prepared you to choose otherwise, is one of the most genuinely difficult things a human being can do. She did not think Bram Cullen was a good person. She did not think one letter erased a year of damage, but she thought he had done a good thing, and she believed those could coexist. She wrote back 1 paragraph. She said she had received his letter and read it. She said she appreciated his honesty. She said she hoped he would use whatever time lay ahead of him to build something worth the building. She signed it, C. Voss. That was all, but she sent it. And she would later tell Odessa, over coffee in Odessa's small office, that sending that 1 paragraph was one of the best decisions she made in that entire difficult year. Odessa, who had seen enough of the world to be skeptical of most things, looked at her for a moment and then said, "Because it was the right thing." And Celestine said, "Yes, because it was the right thing." And if you're still watching at this point,
still with us all the way through, drop a comment right now and tell us where you are watching from. Tell us your city, your state, your country. Show us how far this story has traveled. And if you are not already subscribed, now is the time, because this final chapter is where everything arrives at the place it was always trying to reach. Nadia graduated 2 years later from that small college 2 hours from Harwick. She had stayed in her program, completed her degree, and written a senior thesis on ecological recovery timelines in high-elevation stream systems that her department chair described in the letter accompanying her academic award as unusually mature in its understanding of how damaged things heal. Celestine sat in the second row of the graduation audience. She watched her daughter walk across the stage. She watched Nadia reach for the degree with both hands and hold it for a moment before she looked up and found her mother's face in the crowd immediately, the way people who love each other find each other without searching, as if the mechanism is older and more fundamental than vision. Nadia smiled. Celestine smiled back. That was all it was. 2 people in a crowd, and a smile, and 22 years of everything it contained. No one watching would have known. That was fine. It was not for anyone watching. Aldric stepped back from his operation in stages over the following years, gradually, without drama or ceremony or the announcement that invites questions. Men who have built things over decades tend to untangle themselves from those things slowly, with the care of someone removing something fragile from a place it has been for a long time. He kept certain things. He let go of most. He was home more. He learned at 61 years old to cook eggs properly on Sunday mornings, which required 3 or 4 months of dedicated practice, and resulted in Celestine laughing at him in the kitchen in a way that had nothing to do with victory and everything to do with joy. They traveled eventually. Places Celestine had held quietly in the back of her mind for years, places she had always meant to get to, always deferred because there was always something more immediate, always something that required the particular kind of attention that left no room for anything else. They went. They sat in outdoor restaurants in warm places and talked slowly over food, and felt the particular quality of peace that does not come from the absence of difficulty, but from having passed through a great deal of difficulty together and arrived somewhere on the other side, still intact, still choosing each other.
Nadia built her life. She joined an environmental nonprofit based in a small city in Colorado and did work she loved with the specific commitment of someone who chose their path rather than defaulting into it. At 25, she married a soft-spoken geologist from Oregon named Rafferty, who had the quality of genuinely listening when people spoke, and who made Nadia laugh in the specific way people laugh when they have found someone who understands them at the level below language. They had a daughter when Nadia was 27, a small, loud, spectacularly unimpressed person from the very first moment of her life, and they named her Celia. Celestine held that child for the first time in a warm afternoon in a hospital in Colorado, with Aldric standing beside her and Rafferty asleep in the chair across the room, and she felt something she could not entirely describe, something that had the feeling of completion, which is different from endings. Something that felt like the whole long, complicated arc of the past several years resolving into a single, specific, irreducible moment of rightness. She held Celia. She looked at her daughter, who was watching her from the bed with the particular luminous exhaustion of new mothers, and she thought, yes, all of it, every difficult decision, every long night, every moment of having to become something harder than she wanted to be in order to protect the thing that mattered most, all of it, worth it, every single piece.
Think about the people who've protected you. Not the loud protections, the ones you witnessed in real time, the ones with clear heroes and visible victories. Think about the quiet ones, the conversations that happened on your behalf that you were never in the room for. The decisions made in parked cars and at kitchen tables at 5 in the morning while you were still sleeping, by people who looked at a threat to your well-being and moved toward it without telling you what they were doing, because they did not want you to carry the fear of it along with everything else you were carrying. Think about how many of those moments there have been in your life. How many Celestines? How many people who walked into the difficult room so you would not have to? Have you told them? Have you let them know that you see it, even the parts they never told you about, that you somehow sense anyway, the way you sense certain truths about people you love deeply? Because those people deserve more than gratitude. They deserve to be seen. This story, in its essential shape, is not rare. The specific details belong to a specific world, the kind most people will never be close to, but the heart of it is everywhere. The heart of it is in every parent who has looked at their child and understood with a clarity that cuts through everything else that there is no door too heavy, no room too dangerous, no opposition too formidable to face when the person on the other side of the threat is your own heart walking around outside your body. That instinct, that absolute, unqualified, immovable refusal to let the people you love be harmed without a response, lives in homes across this country, in circumstances that look nothing like this story and feel exactly like it. Was what Celestine did right? That is the question worth sitting with tonight. Was there another path she should have taken? Was the choice to go alone the right one? Or was there a version of this where asking for help earlier would have changed things for the better? And what does it say about a world where a mother has to become something formidable to walk her daughter back from a threat that never should have come near her? What does it say about the systems we build or fail to build to protect ordinary people from the kind of power that believes it exists above accountability? Leave your thoughts below. Every comment matters. Every perspective adds something real to this conversation. And if this story landed somewhere in you, if it touched something real, share it with someone today. Because sometimes the most powerful thing you can do for someone you love is hand them a story that says you are not alone in the hard parts of life. Other people have faced things just as large, and they have come through. If you want to see what comes next, and there are more stories where this one came from, more moments of quiet, extraordinary courage that the world does not celebrate loudly enough, make sure you're subscribed. Turn on the notification bell. The next story is coming, and it will stay with you.